Kendall Diaz was 43 years old, wearing a wrinkled gray shirt from Costco and a 12-year-old Casio watch, when his wife fired him in front of the entire executive board on the 18th floor of Brooks Table headquarters in downtown Nashville. Most people in that room believed Kendall was just the quiet husband who handled spreadsheets while Savannah Brooks built a celebrity empire. They saw the old Ford Explorer, the cheap coffee in his hand, the way he never spoke during interviews. What they didn't know was that Kendall had spent 11 years quietly saving every contract, every wire transfer, and every signature tied to the company they thought belonged only to Savannah. Then he slid a thick brown envelope across the walnut conference table, and suddenly nobody in the room touched their coffee anymore. If you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, comment your country and local time below. I always like seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow-burn betrayal stories with real consequences, subscribe now. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. 11 years earlier, Kendall Diaz still wore pressed dress shirts and carried a leather laptop bag with the Commerce Bank logo stitched into the side. Back then, nobody looked at him and saw a future business manager. They saw a reliable financial analyst with steady hands and predictable habits. 32 years old, clean apartment, good credit score, retirement account already growing, the kind of man who ordered the same lunch every Tuesday from the same deli in downtown Kansas City. Turkey sandwich, no mayo, black coffee. His co-workers joked that Kendall probably scheduled his own breathing. He never reacted. Most people mistook silence for emptiness. That summer, Savannah Brooks owned a rusted food truck parked behind a gas station on East 12th Street. The truck's paint was fading. The smoker barely worked. The freezer leaked water onto the floor every night. But the line around the truck kept getting longer. Savannah had something people remembered, not polish, presence. The smell of smoked brisket drifted half a block down the street. Construction workers came first, then office employees, then local bloggers with cameras and fake enthusiasm. Kendall noticed her because she forgot to charge him for cornbread 3 times in 1 month. The 4th time, he handed the extra cash back through the truck window. "You keep undercharging people," he told her calmly. Savannah laughed while wiping sauce from her wrist with a towel. Most people don't complain about free food. Most businesses fail because they don't notice small leaks. That line stayed with her. 3 months later, Kendall started spending evenings inside the food truck after work, not cooking, fixing things. He reorganized supplier invoices first, then inventory sheets, then tax filings stacked in cardboard boxes under the sink beside cleaning chemicals. Savannah had talent, but the business itself was chaos. Receipts shoved into coffee cans, cash payments with no records, vendor contracts signed without review, one health inspection away from disaster. Kendall sat at a folding table inside his apartment night after night building spreadsheets while Savannah slept on his couch after 14-hour shifts. Rows of numbers filled the screen until 2 in the morning, projected food costs, labor percentages, quarterly tax estimates, vendor comparisons. He built systems before Brooks Table even existed as a name. Savannah noticed. At first, she treated Kendall carefully, like someone holding something fragile. She brought him coffee during late nights. She rubbed his shoulders while he worked. Sometimes she sat quietly across from him, eating leftover brisket while he explained payroll calculations she barely understood. "You know you don't have to do all this, right?" she once asked. Kendall kept typing. "If you want the business to survive 3 years, somebody does." That winter, the transmission died on Savannah's truck during a catering job outside Columbia, Missouri. She stood beside the highway crying while snow gathered along the shoulder. Kendall drove 2 hours in freezing rain to pick her up. He didn't lecture her, didn't complain. He simply sat in silence while the tow truck dragged the food truck toward Kansas City. 2 weeks later, Kendall emptied nearly $40,000 from his personal savings account. Money he had planned to use for a condo down payment. Instead, he bought Savannah a commercial smoker from Oklahoma City. Steel black finish, triple rack system, custom temperature controls. Savannah stared at the machine inside the warehouse loading dock like she was looking at a cathedral. "You used your savings," she whispered. Kendall shrugged once. The old smoker was killing consistency. No dramatic speech, no demand for gratitude, just numbers and solutions. That was how Kendall loved people, quietly, completely. By 2015, Brooks Smoke and Spice had become Brooks Table. The rebrand came from Kendall. So did the logo. So did the LLC registration. Savannah became the face. Kendall became the structure underneath it. They moved to Nashville after a Tennessee food festival video went viral online. A local investor offered funding for a small restaurant near Germantown. The building used to be an old tire repair shop. The kitchen plumbing barely functioned. The roof leaked during storms. Savannah saw opportunity. Kendall saw risk. But he also saw numbers that finally worked. For the first time, the margins looked stable. He negotiated supplier contracts himself, locked meat prices for 18 months, structured payroll systems, installed accounting software, built relationships with regional farms. While Savannah learned camera angles for local television segments, Kendall learned labor law regulations for Tennessee restaurants. He worked 18-hour days without mentioning exhaustion once. During the grand opening week, Kendall slept inside the office twice because an overnight refrigeration failure nearly destroyed $6,000 of inventory. Nobody saw that part. Customers only saw Savannah smiling under warm lights while food bloggers photographed bourbon-glazed ribs. And Savannah deserved credit. She really was talented. People drove across state lines for her food. But talent alone did not build stable companies. Kendall understood that better than anyone in the building. One Friday night, 6 months after opening, Savannah found him asleep at his desk around 1:30 a.m. The office lights were still on. Spreadsheet projections covered both monitors. A cold coffee sat beside his arm. His glasses had slipped halfway down his face. Savannah touched his shoulder gently. "Kendall." He woke instantly, not confused, not angry, just alert. "I fixed the supplier discrepancy," he murmured immediately. "And I renegotiated the insurance policy this afternoon." Savannah stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "You're the reason this works," she whispered. Kendall looked uncomfortable hearing it. He always did. Praise never sat naturally on him. Outside Nashville, traffic hissed through wet streets after midnight rain. Inside that tiny office, Brooks' table still looked small enough to fail. But Kendall already had expansion projections hidden inside a folder labeled Year 3. He planned farther ahead than anyone realized, including Savannah. And that was exactly why, years later, when everybody else underestimated him, they made the worst mistake of their lives. By 2018, Brooks' table no longer smelled like smoke and wet concrete. It smelled like money. The flagship restaurant sat on a renovated corner property near Nashville's Germantown district. Black exterior walls, copper lighting fixtures, valet parking after 5 o'clock, a 3-week reservation wait list. People flew in from Chicago and Dallas just to post photos of Savannah Brooks' bourbon maple short ribs online. Food magazines called her the Southern Chef, redefining modern barbecue. Kendall Diaz hated most magazine articles because they always left out the numbers. Nobody wrote about payroll taxes. Nobody wrote about supplier disputes at 4 in the morning. Nobody wrote about insurance audits or refrigeration contracts or labor compliance. They only photographed Savannah smiling beneath warm restaurant lighting while holding expensive knives. Kendall understood the business had reached a dangerous stage. The moment investors started complimenting atmosphere more than operations. Rapid growth killed companies faster than failure ever did, especially restaurants. Especially celebrity-driven brands. He spent most mornings inside a glass office overlooking the parking lot wearing the same muted button-down shirts while reviewing reports before sunrise. Food cost percentages, liquor shrinkage, vendor reliability, labor projections. He watched numbers the way paramedics watched heart monitors. Tiny changes mattered. A 2% rise in meat pricing could destroy quarterly projections. One lawsuit could wipe out expansion plans. One payroll mistake could trigger state investigations. Savannah rarely saw those details anymore. Not because she stopped caring, because her world had changed. Television appearances started first, then podcasts, then sponsorship offers. Kentucky bourbon partnerships, knife collections, cooking demonstrations in Las Vegas, guest appearances on Food Network holiday specials. Kendall handled every contract personally, every clause, every licensing agreement, every tax implication. He once spent 6 straight hours rewriting a sponsorship deal because a beverage company tried slipping perpetual image rights into the contract. Savannah never even saw the original version. She simply walked into the kitchen the next morning and found Kendall asleep in his office chair with legal documents spread across the floor. "You stayed here all night again?" she asked quietly. Kendall rubbed his eyes once. They were trying to take ownership percentages from future media revenue. Savannah frowned. "What, I fixed it?" That was always his answer. "I fixed it." Then he moved on to the next problem before anyone realized there had been one. Brooks' Table expanded to a second location in Franklin, Tennessee, 6 months later, then a third in Knoxville. Kendall built systems faster than the company grew. Centralized inventory, digital payroll management, regional vendor protections, emergency reserve accounts. He even designed internal fraud prevention procedures after discovering a kitchen manager stealing liquor inventory. The manager disappeared quietly within 48 hours. No scandal, no public drama. Kendall preferred problems buried before they became headlines. That was why employees trusted him more than they admitted publicly. Line cooks stopped by his office when rent problems hit. Servers asked him for help understanding health insurance paperwork. Managers called him before calling Savannah during emergencies, not because Savannah was cruel, because Kendall listened longer and talked less. Leah Turner understood that better than anyone. She had worked at Brooks' Table since the food truck days, and now oversaw operations across all 3 locations. One rainy Tuesday evening, she stood inside Kendall's office, holding inventory reports while thunder rolled over Nashville. "You know what the staff calls you?" she asked. Kendall barely looked up from his monitor. "That usually means I won't enjoy the answer. They call you the firewall." He paused. Leah smirked slightly. "Because every disaster hits you before it reaches everyone else." Kendall leaned back slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "It is exhausting," Leah replied. "For you." He didn't answer. Outside the office window, kitchen staff loaded supply crates into delivery vans under heavy rain. Business looked strong from the outside. Inside, Kendall already saw cracks forming, and most of those cracks arrived wearing expensive suits. Ethan Cole entered Brooks' Table through Savannah's media agency in early 2019. 38 years old, Atlanta-based, perfect haircut, perfect teeth, the kind of man who never loosened his tie even during outdoor summer events. He introduced himself like someone pitching stock options. Fast handshake, long eye contact, confident smile calibrated for cameras. Kendall disliked him within 8 minutes, not emotionally, mathematically. People like Ethan created instability. Too polished, too fast, too focused on appearance. During their first strategy meeting, Ethan spent 20 minutes discussing brand elevation opportunities while barely mentioning operational costs. Kendall sat silently near the end of the conference table taking notes. Finally, he asked one question. "What's the projected customer retention rate after expansion?" Ethan smiled politely. "We're thinking much bigger than retention right now. That wasn't an answer. Kendall noticed Savannah didn't seem bothered by it. That bothered him more. Within months, Ethan became difficult to avoid. He appeared everywhere. Photo shoots, investor dinners, launch parties, media coaching sessions. He started reshaping Savannah's public image from successful chef into lifestyle entrepreneur. Less barbecue smoke, more luxury branding, more designer clothing, more celebrity networking events in Los Angeles and New York. Savannah adapted quickly, faster than Kendall expected. One evening at their home in Belle Meade, Kendall walked downstairs around midnight and found Savannah rehearsing interview answers with Ethan over Zoom inside the kitchen. Wine glass in hand, designer samples spread across the marble island. Ethan laughed through laptop speakers. Savannah laughed with him. Kendall stood quietly near the doorway for several seconds before Savannah noticed him. "Oh, hey," she said casually. "We're just reviewing media prep for the Westbridge meeting, Westbridge Foods." That caught his attention immediately. National distribution company, massive scale, massive risk. Kendall walked toward the counter slowly. "Why am I hearing about Westbridge from Zoom calls?" Savannah exchanged a quick glance toward the screen. Ethan answered first. "We're still in preliminary conversations." Kendall looked directly at him. Preliminary conversations involving national licensing should still involve financial oversight. Ethan smiled again, always smiling. "That's why we have you, Kendall. Not partner, not co-founder, not builder, just Kendall, like an employee standing too close to executive conversations." Savannah didn't correct him. That silence stayed with Kendall longer than the actual words. After the call ended, Savannah tried explaining. "It's just branding strategy stuff. You hate those meetings anyway." Kendall stared at the untouched dinner plate beside the sink. Cold food, untouched whiskey glass, midnight kitchen lights. "You used to ask my opinion before meetings happened," he said quietly. Savannah crossed her arms. "And you used to trust me more." That landed harder than she realized, because Kendall did trust her. He just didn't trust the people gathering around her, especially Ethan. Over the following months, Ethan slowly repositioned Kendall inside the company without formally touching his title. He excluded him from media strategy sessions, redirected investor communications, scheduled meetings during times Kendall was handling operations emergencies. Then came the jokes, small at first, harmless enough for outsiders to ignore. Don't overwhelm Kendall with branding talk. Kendall still thinks Excel spreadsheets are exciting. Our guy's basically a human calculator. Board members laughed politely. Savannah sometimes smiled with them. Kendall never reacted publicly, but he noticed patterns, and patterns mattered, especially when they appeared right before financial manipulation. Late one night, while reviewing quarterly expense reports alone inside headquarters, Kendall noticed something unusual. 3 new consulting firms added to payroll distributions, large payments, minimal documentation, unfamiliar addresses. He clicked deeper into vendor records, then stopped moving entirely. One payment had originated through a Delaware LLC registered only 4 months earlier, another linked to a mailbox service outside Miami. Kendall stared at the screen silently while the office air conditioner hummed overhead. Then he opened a private folder on his desktop, and for the first time in 11 years, he began saving evidence against his own company. Kendall Diaz first realized he was becoming invisible during a charity dinner at the Thompson Nashville Hotel. The event raised money for culinary scholarships. Local politicians attended. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Nashville socialites drifted between tables holding wine glasses and rehearsed smiles. Savannah stood near the ballroom stage wearing a dark emerald dress, while reporters surrounded her in a semicircle. Ethan Cole stayed close beside her like a second shadow. Kendall stood 15 feet away near the back wall reviewing catering invoices on his phone. That distance said more than anyone in the room understood. 3 years earlier, Savannah would have walked over between interviews and introduced him properly. "This is Kendall," she would say. "He built this with me." Now people simply nodded politely at him before returning attention to Savannah and Ethan. Kendall noticed details because details were his profession. Who investors spoke to first, who board members laughed with, who security opened doors for. Respect moved quietly through rooms long before titles changed officially, and respect around Brooks' table had started shifting. A local television anchor approached Savannah with a microphone. "What's next for the Brooks brand?" she asked. Savannah smiled naturally for the cameras. "We're expanding nationally, bigger partnerships, bigger opportunities." The reporter nodded eagerly. "And Ethan Cole has been instrumental in helping shape that vision." Ethan gave a practiced, humble smile. Kendall lowered his eyes back to the catering numbers. Nobody asked who negotiated the lease protections. Nobody asked who structured the expansion financing. Nobody asked who kept the company debt ratio low enough for investors to trust them. Invisible work stayed invisible, especially when done correctly. Later that night, Kendall and Savannah rode home separately. Savannah left with investors after the event. Kendall stayed behind organizing vendor issues because one refrigeration truck arrived late. By the time he pulled into the driveway of their Belmead home, it was almost 100 a.m. The downstairs lights were still on. Savannah sat barefoot at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone while unopened PR packages covered half the counter. Designer cookware, alcohol sponsorship kits, luxury skincare boxes from Los Angeles companies trying to partner with celebrity chefs. The kitchen barely looked lived in anymore. It looked staged. Savannah glanced up briefly. "You stayed late, truck issue." She nodded absent-mindedly. Kendall opened the refrigerator and drank water straight from a glass bottle. The silence between them no longer felt tired. It felt managed, careful, like both people understood something had shifted, but neither wanted to define it yet. Savannah finally broke the quiet. "Ethan thinks we should move headquarters downtown." Kendall leaned against the counter. "Why?" "He says investors expect a stronger image. We already own the current building. He thinks it looks small." Kendall almost smiled at that. The company had survived because he worried about balance sheets, while everyone else worried about appearances. "A building doesn't improve operations," he said calmly. Savannah sighed. "You always say things like that because they're usually true." Her expression tightened slightly. That happened more often lately whenever Kendall questioned decisions connected to Ethan. Not explosive anger, just irritation. Like Kendall had become an obstacle, slowing momentum. Savannah turned her phone around toward him. A rendering of a sleek new office tower appeared on the screen. Glass walls, luxury conference spaces, rooftop branding area. Ethan's fingerprints were all over it. "How much?" Kendall asked. $3.8 million lease commitment." Kendall stared for 2 seconds too long. "Absolutely not." Savannah crossed her arms immediately. "See, this is exactly what Ethan means." "What does Ethan mean?" "That you think too small." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Because Kendall remembered the apartment where Savannah once cried over unpaid supplier invoices. He remembered counting quarters for gas money during the food truck years. He remembered using his retirement savings so Brooks' table could survive another winter. Thinking small had kept them alive long enough to become successful. But Kendall didn't argue emotionally. He never did. "National expansion increases volatility," he said evenly. "Large lease obligations before Westbridge closes the distribution agreement would be reckless." Savannah looked away. "You always make everything sound dangerous because most business growth is dangerous." She stood from the chair abruptly. "Well, maybe I'm tired of operating like we're still fixing a leaking food truck." Then she walked upstairs. Kendall remained alone in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes. Not angry, just still. The refrigerator hummed softly. Rain tapped against the windows. On the counter beside him sat a branded press packet with Savannah's face printed across the front. No mention of co-founders, No mention of operations leadership. Only Savannah Brooks, founder, visionary, CEO. Kendall finally turned off the downstairs lights himself. The next morning he arrived at headquarters before sunrise as usual. The old building no longer matched Brooks' table's image, according to Ethan, but Kendall liked it. Functional, efficient, paid off. He walked through quiet hallways carrying black coffee while kitchen prep crews unloaded produce trucks behind the building. Leah Turner intercepted him near operations. "You look terrible," she said immediately. "Good morning to you too," she lowered her voice. "You need to watch Ethan." Kendall stopped walking. Leah rarely spoke emotionally at work. That alone mattered. What happened? "He pushed out Carla from regional purchasing yesterday." Kendall frowned. "Carla's been here 6 years. She disagreed with a vendor switch. Which vendor?" Leah handed him a printed invoice. Kendall scanned the page silently. The new supplier pricing was significantly higher, too high, especially for frozen inventory transportation. Who approved this? Savannah signed it. That bothered Kendall more than the numbers themselves. Savannah usually reviewed major operational changes with him first. Now contracts moved around him instead of through him. Leah watched his face carefully. "You think something's wrong?" Kendall folded the invoice once. "I think someone's moving too fast." That afternoon, he stayed inside his office reviewing recent consulting expenses connected to Ethan's expansion strategy. The patterns worsened the deeper he looked. Luxury branding consultants from Miami, media coordination firms in Los Angeles, marketing retainers with vague descriptions, high invoices, thin documentation, and every payment approved quickly, faster than Brooks' table normally processed anything. Kendall opened another vendor file, then another, then another. 3 companies shared nearly identical formatting structures on invoices, same font alignment, same accounting codes. His eyes narrowed slightly. Patterns again, always patterns. A knock interrupted him. Savannah entered without waiting for an answer. "You missed the investor lunch. I was reviewing expenses." She leaned against the doorway. "You've been reviewing expenses non-stop lately, because they keep increasing." Savannah exhaled slowly. "You don't trust Ethan. I trust verifiable numbers." "That's not an answer." Kendall finally looked directly at her. "Yes, it is." Silence settled heavily between them. Savannah glanced around the office, almost like she no longer belonged inside it, or maybe like she had already mentally moved somewhere else. "Ethan says, your approach scares investors sometimes," she said carefully. Kendall stared at her, not wounded, not shocked, just quiet. "What part?" he asked. "The constant caution, the audits, the questions. That's literally my job." "He says modern companies move faster." Kendall leaned back slowly in his chair. "And when modern companies collapse, they collapse faster too." Savannah rubbed her forehead. "You always do this, do what make everything feel heavy." The strange thing was, Kendall understood exactly what she meant, because he carried the weight she no longer had to see. Tax exposure, payroll liabilities, vendor risks, insurance coverage gaps, the ugly machinery underneath success. Savannah lived closer to spotlight now. Kendall lived underneath the stage, holding the structure together, and people standing in bright lights often forgot who built the floor beneath them. After Savannah left, Kendall sat motionless for several seconds. Then he opened the locked bottom drawer of his desk. Inside sat 2 external hard drives, blank folders, fresh backups, quiet preparation, not revenge, not yet, just protection. Because for the first time in 11 years, Kendall no longer trusted the people inside his own company. The first fake invoice arrived on a Thursday morning in October. Kendall Diaz noticed it at 6:14 a.m. while sitting alone inside his office with a protein bar still unopened beside his keyboard. Most people would have missed it. The invoice looked professional. Sharp formatting, clean branding, correct vendor terminology. Consulting services related to strategic distribution optimization, $480,000. Wire transfer requested within 72 hours. Everything about it appeared legitimate at first glance. Except the numbers moved wrong. Kendall believed numbers had rhythm. Healthy businesses developed patterns over time. Payroll cycles, vendor frequencies, seasonal fluctuations, operational consistency. Fraud disrupted rhythm, sometimes only slightly. This invoice disrupted it immediately. He clicked into the vendor file. Silver Ridge Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware 4 months earlier. No long-term contract history. No tax documentation beyond a basic EIN filing. Minimal operational records. Kendall leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside his office window, Nashville traffic crawled through gray morning rain while kitchen crews unloaded produce deliveries behind headquarters. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly above rows of silent computers. He opened another screen. Vendor payment histories. Then another. Cross-reference approvals. Then another. Communication logs. The deeper he looked, the quieter he became. Every approval connected back through Ethan Cole's department. Every expedited payment bypassed standard review timelines, and Savannah had signed most of them electronically without revision. Kendall stared at the screen for nearly 30 seconds before touching his coffee. Cold already. He never drank it. At 7:02 a.m., Leah Turner entered the office carrying inventory reports. She stopped immediately after seeing his face. What happened? Kendall turned the monitor slightly toward her. Leah scanned the invoice once, then again, slower. That number's insane. It's not the number, Kendall replied calmly. It's the structure. He pointed toward the metadata. Invoice created 36 minutes before submission. Leah frowned. That bad, real consulting firms don't bill $500,000 overnight. He clicked deeper into payment routing. The receiving account belonged to a regional bank outside Wilmington. Not impossible, but strange, especially for a company supposedly managing national-level expansion strategy. Leah lowered her voice instinctively. You think Ethan's stealing? Kendall didn't answer immediately. Accusations required evidence, and Kendall never moved emotionally when numbers were involved. I think someone expects nobody to check carefully. That answer unsettled Leah more than anger would have, because Kendall only sounded that calm when he was absolutely certain something mattered. By noon, Kendall had already copied every related document into a separate encrypted folder stored outside Brooks Table's internal servers. Contracts, approval logs, wire requests, vendor records. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just preservation, quiet preparation, the kind most people ignored until it was too late. At 2 p.m., Savannah arrived at headquarters from a television appearance in Atlanta. The energy around her entered rooms before she did now. Assistants moving quickly, phones ringing, PR people laughing too loudly. Ethan walked beside her carrying 2 garment bags from a luxury clothing sponsor. Savannah spotted Kendall through the glass office wall. Hey, she said while stepping inside. You missed the call with Westbridge. I was reviewing consulting payments. Ethan remained near the doorway. Relaxed posture, expensive cologne, controlled smile. We're scaling nationally, he said smoothly. Consulting costs increase. Kendall rotated his monitor toward Savannah. Did you review this before approving it? Savannah glanced briefly at the invoice. Ethan's team already vetted it. That wasn't my question. A tiny shift entered the room after that, not shouting, not confrontation, pressure. Savannah crossed her arms slightly. We can't bottleneck every decision through accounting anymore. Kendall kept his voice level. $480,000 isn't a bottleneck, it's exposure. Ethan chuckled softly. There's the spreadsheet cowboy again. Savannah smiled faintly at the joke. Only for a second, but Kendall saw it. And once seen things could not become unseen. He looked back at the invoice. Why is the company registered to a mailbox service? Ethan answered immediately. Privacy structuring. For a consulting vendor, it's common. No, Kendall said quietly. It isn't. Silence. Savannah rubbed her temple. Kendall, we're in negotiations with a national distributor. We cannot operate like a small-town barbecue truck forever. The sentence hit harder than she intended, because Kendall remembered exactly what that truck had looked like. The leaking freezer, the cracked tires, the nights he slept inside warehouses protecting inventory during storms. He remembered all of it, and suddenly Savannah spoke about those years like they were embarrassing. Kendall closed the invoice window calmly. I'm delaying payment until verification clears. Ethan's smile disappeared for the first time. You don't have unilateral authority anymore. Kendall looked directly at him. I built the authority structure. The room went still. Savannah exhaled sharply. Not now, she muttered. Then she walked away, with Ethan following beside her. Kendall remained seated alone. His office suddenly felt colder, not because of the argument, because of the realization underneath it. Savannah no longer instinctively trusted him over outsiders. That changed everything. That night, Kendall drove downtown instead of going home. Rain coated Broadway in blurred neon reflections, while tourists stumbled between bars carrying plastic cups and loud voices. He parked outside a brick law office near Printer's Alley. Margaret Holloway worked on the 7th floor, 62 years old, corporate litigation specialist, former SEC attorney. Kendall had hired her years earlier during a supplier lawsuit involving fraudulent meat contracts. She respected documentation more than personalities. That was why Kendall trusted her. Margaret opened the office door herself after hours. You look tired, she said immediately. You said to call if patterns changed. I did. She led him into a conference room overlooking downtown Nashville. Kendall spread documents across the polished wooden table with careful precision. Invoices, vendor structures, wire transfer routing, approval chains. Margaret read quietly for nearly 15 minutes. No interruptions, no dramatic reactions, only the soft turning of pages. Finally, she removed her reading glasses slowly. How long have you been seeing this? 3 months. And you didn't stop it. I needed enough documentation to prove intent. Margaret studied him carefully. You already think this is fraud. Kendall rested both hands flat against the table. I think someone's building extraction channels before the Westbridge acquisition closes. Margaret nodded once. That answer told her everything. She flipped toward the Delaware registration forms again, then paused. Interesting. Kendall looked up. The registered agent for this LLC overlaps with another vendor you flagged 6 weeks ago. Kendall's expression didn't move, but internally pieces aligned instantly. Patterns again. Margaret leaned back in her chair. If someone's stealing, she said quietly, they're not stealing fast. Rain tapped softly against the conference room windows. Downtown lights shimmered below them. Kendall remained completely still. Margaret continued. They're stealing quietly. Those words settled heavily in the room, because Kendall understood quiet theft better than loud destruction. Quiet theft survived longer. Quiet theft hid inside trust, inside growth, inside distraction, inside ego. Margaret folded her hands together. Do not confront anyone yet. I wasn't planning to. Good, because if this escalates, emotional reactions will hurt you. Kendall almost smiled faintly. I'm not emotional about numbers. No, Margaret said carefully. You're emotional about Savannah. That one landed, because despite everything, he still was. Margaret slid the documents back toward him. Keep collecting records legally. Back up everything outside company servers. And Kendall, he looked up. If this reaches court someday, the calmest person in the room usually wins. Around midnight, Kendall returned to headquarters alone. Most lights were off except operations and executive offices. He sat quietly at his desk while transferring encrypted backups onto an external hard drive. File after file, invoice histories, internal emails, vendor approvals. Then one email chain stopped him cold. A transfer authorization connected directly to a Florida holding company. Registered owner Daniel Cole, Ethan's younger brother. Kendall stared at the screen silently while the hard drive continued humming beside him. Outside, thunder rolled across Nashville. Inside Brooks Table headquarters, 11 years of trust began collapsing one document at a time. The firing happened 3 weeks before Brooks Table was supposed to finalize the biggest deal in company history. Westbridge Foods planned to distribute Savannah Brooks's frozen meal line into more than 2,000 grocery stores across the country. Target, Kroger, Publix, Safeway. The projected valuation after the deal exceeded $90 million. Television networks called Savannah America's next culinary empire. Investors started using words like scalable and acquisition-ready. Kendall Diaz used different words privately. Over-leveraged, unstable, exposed, because while everyone else celebrated growth, Kendall kept finding missing money buried beneath expansion expenses. The Florida connection tied to Ethan's brother was only the beginning. Over 14 days, Kendall uncovered nearly $2.3 million routed through layered consulting vendors connected indirectly to Ethan Cole, not stolen in giant amounts, broken apart carefully, small enough to avoid immediate panic, large enough to matter, and every trail eventually disappeared into shell companies. Kendall copied everything, quietly, systematically. No emotional confrontation, no dramatic accusations, just evidence. At home, Savannah barely noticed the distance growing between them because she barely stopped moving anymore. Los Angeles interviews, New York investor dinners, brand photo shoots, streaming platform negotiations. One night, Kendall sat alone in their kitchen, eating reheated pasta, while Savannah discussed licensing opportunities with Ethan through speakerphone in the next room. He listened without trying to. "You need cleaner leadership optics," Ethan said through the speaker. "What does that mean exactly?" Savannah asked. "It means national brands don't want husband-wife management structures. Investors trust executive hierarchy." Kendall slowly lowered his fork. Silence followed. Then Savannah spoke again. "So what are you suggesting?" Ethan's answer came smooth and immediate. "We modernize." Kendall didn't finish eating. He washed his plate, carefully dried it, and placed it back into the cabinet while their conversation continued in the background. Not once did Savannah come into the kitchen. Not once did she ask if he heard. That told him enough. 3 days later, Richard Bennett called for an emergency executive meeting at Brooks Table headquarters. Thursday, 9 a.m., mandatory attendance. Kendall already knew what was coming before he entered the room, not because someone warned him, because patterns always arrived before outcomes. The conference room overlooked downtown Nashville through massive glass windows. Rain clouds hung low above the city skyline, while executives arranged coffee cups and tablets around the walnut table. Savannah sat near the center wearing a cream-colored blazer Kendall had never seen before. Ethan stood beside the presentation monitor reviewing slides with quiet confidence. Richard Bennett avoided eye contact completely. That mattered. Leah Turner stood near the back wall looking tense. Kendall took his usual seat without speaking. He placed a thin brown envelope beside his notebook, then folded his hands calmly. The meeting began with growth projections, quarterly expansion metrics, projected Westbridge revenue, public relations forecasts. Kendall barely listened, because none of it explained why legal counsel had suddenly joined in the meeting. 2 attorneys sat near the end of the table, pretending not to observe him directly. Ethan eventually stepped forward. As Brooks Table enters national expansion, he began smoothly. Leadership restructuring becomes necessary for investor confidence and operational modernization. Kendall remained expressionless. Savannah stared down at prepared notes. Not at him, never at him. Ethan clicked to the next slide. New organizational structure. Kendall's name appeared halfway down the chart, beneath two new executive titles Ethan had created recently: Chief Brand Officer, Strategic Growth Director, both above him. Interesting. Ethan continued speaking like a consultant narrating a sales pitch. We've reached a point where centralized financial management under legacy structures creates inefficiency. Legacy structures. Kendall almost smiled at the wording. 11 years reduced to a corporate phrase. Richard Bennett finally cleared his throat. Kendall, this isn't personal. People only said that before doing something deeply personal. Savannah finally spoke. Her voice sounded rehearsed. We think it's time to transition financial operations into a more scalable executive framework. We think, not I think, not Ethan thinks. Corporate language again. Kendall looked at her quietly. And my role, Savannah inhaled slowly before answering. We're terminating your position as business manager, effective immediately. The room went silent. Even the air conditioner sounded louder afterward. Leah shifted uncomfortably near the wall. Richard Bennett stared into his coffee. Ethan remained standing with both hands folded confidently in front of him. Kendall spoke only once. Who prepared this? Ethan answered before Savannah could. The board approved the restructuring unanimously. Kendall nodded once. No anger, no raised voice. That unsettled the room more than outrage would have. Savannah seemed almost thrown by his calmness. We'll provide a severance package, she added quickly. And obviously, your ownership interests in marital assets can be discussed separately. Marital assets, not company equity. Interesting again. Kendall finally opened the brown envelope beside him. Inside sat several documents. He slid one copy across the table toward Richard Bennett, then another toward legal counsel. Ethan frowned immediately. What is this? Kendall answered calmly. Operating agreement revisions from 2016. Richard adjusted his glasses while scanning the pages. The color in his face changed almost immediately. Ethan noticed. Savannah noticed too. Kendall continued quietly. You attempted to terminate a founding partner with protected audit authority. Nobody spoke. Rain struck the conference room windows harder outside. Ethan recovered first. This doesn't change the restructuring. It changes whether this meeting was legally competent, Kendall replied. The legal counsel beside Richard suddenly sat forward. Why wasn't this document included in the board review package? Nobody answered, because nobody besides Kendall had probably read the original corporate structure in years. That was the danger of letting quiet people handle everything for too long. Eventually, everyone forgot how much control they actually had. Savannah looked genuinely confused now. Kendall, you own 51% operational control, he said evenly. I retained 38% founding equity and independent audit rights under expansion clauses. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard looked furious now. At no point was this explained during restructuring discussions. Ethan immediately pivoted. This is procedural. We can revisit legal technicalities later. No, Kendall said softly. You really can't. Then he reached into his briefcase and placed a black external hard drive onto the conference table. Small, silent, heavy enough to change the entire room. What's on that? Savannah asked quietly. Kendall looked at her for the first time since the meeting started. His face showed almost nothing now, just exhaustion. Everything. The silence afterward stretched painfully long. Ethan forced a dismissive laugh. This is ridiculous. Kendall ignored him completely. Instead, he calmly removed his company badge from his pocket and placed it beside the hard drive. Then his office keys. Then his corporate credit card. No dramatic gestures, just orderly separation. Savannah suddenly stood. Kendall, don't do this. The sentence came too late, because the decision had already happened long before this room. Kendall gathered his notebook slowly. I'll have legal communication directed through counsel moving forward. Ethan scoffed lightly. You're making a huge mistake. Kendall paused near the conference room door, then finally answered, "No." His voice remained low, measured, cold. The mistake already happened, and for the first time since Ethan Cole entered Brooks' table, nobody in the room looked confident anymore. Kendall Diaz left Brooks' table headquarters carrying only a black leather briefcase and the same dark navy coat he had worn for nearly 6 winters. Nobody followed him into the elevator. Not Savannah. Not Richard Bennett. Not Ethan Cole. The doors closed slowly while the 18th floor conference room disappeared behind polished steel reflections. Kendall stood alone inside the descending elevator with one hand in his coat pocket and the other holding the external hard drive. His breathing never changed. That was the unsettling thing about him. Most people expected anger after betrayal, or grief, or panic. Kendall became quieter instead. And quiet men frightened people once they stopped explaining themselves. The elevator opened into the marble lobby. Receptionists avoided eye contact. 2 junior accountants near the coffee station immediately stopped whispering when they saw him walking toward the exit. News traveled fast inside companies, especially bad news. Outside, cold November rain drifted across downtown Nashville in thin gray sheets. Kendall crossed the street without opening an umbrella. His phone vibrated once before he reached the parking garage. "Margaret Holloway." He answered immediately. "You got removed faster than I expected," she said. "They were preparing it for weeks." "You sound calm. I already knew." Margaret paused briefly. "Can you come to the office? I'm on my way." The drive through downtown Nashville took 23 minutes because of traffic near Broadway. Kendall barely noticed the congestion. His thoughts moved elsewhere now. Not toward revenge, toward sequence. What needed protecting first? What needed proving second? What legal exposure existed if Brooks' table attempted damage control publicly? He mentally organized risk the way some people organized emotions, by category, by probability, by consequence. When Kendall arrived at Margaret Holloway's office near Printer's Alley, the rain had intensified into steady, cold drizzle, coating the sidewalks in silver reflections. Margaret already had files spread across the conference room table when he entered. No small talk, no sympathy. That was another reason Kendall respected her. She treated crises like engineering problems. "You recorded the meeting?" she asked. Kendall handed her a digital recorder from his coat pocket. "Entire thing?" "Good." Margaret connected headphones and listened silently for several minutes while Kendall removed his wet coat. The only sounds in the room came from rain striking the windows and the distant hum of downtown traffic below. Finally, Margaret removed the headphones slowly. They made 2 major mistakes. Kendall sat across from her. "I know one. They terminated you without acknowledging protected ownership structure. And the second," Margaret slid the operating agreement across the table. "They assumed you were only an employee." Kendall looked down at the documents he had signed nearly a decade earlier. Most people inside Brooks' table probably forgot those papers existed. Savannah definitely had. Back then, during the early expansion years, Kendall insisted on proper corporate structuring because restaurant businesses failed constantly. Partnership protection mattered. Liability separation mattered. Audit authority mattered. Savannah trusted him completely in those days, so she signed everything without resistance. Margaret tapped a section of the agreement. "You retained independent audit rights, tied to financial irregularities and acquisition events." Kendall nodded once. "Westbridge triggered the clause." "Exactly." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "They legally cannot remove your access rights until a formal review occurs." Kendall stared toward the rain-covered skyline outside the windows. "That'll make Ethan nervous." "It should." Margaret opened another folder. Inside sat copies of wire transfers Kendall had uncovered over the previous month. "The fraud angle concerns me more." Kendall's expression remained still. "Same." Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Walk me through the Florida connection again." Kendall explained methodically. shell vendors, layered consulting fees, rapid invoice approvals, routing patterns tied indirectly to Ethan's younger brother, every detail precise, chronological. Emotion removed completely. Margaret listened without interruption. When he finished, she folded her hands together carefully. If this reaches litigation, she said, the board's negligence becomes a serious issue. They trusted Ethan. They ignored governance. That too. Margaret watched him closely. You're not protecting Savannah anymore. The sentence hung in the room quietly, because for years Kendall had done exactly that, protected her from operational disasters, from lawsuits, from bad contracts, from consequences she never even saw approaching. But protection had limits, especially once trust disappeared. I'm protecting the company, Kendall answered finally. Margaret gave a slight nod. Not agreement, recognition. Around 7 p.m., Leah Turner arrived carrying 3 storage boxes filled with copied operational files. She looked exhausted. They locked me out of finance servers this afternoon, she said immediately. Kendall looked up sharply. Who authorized it, Ethan? Margaret's eyes narrowed instantly. That's obstruction if an audit request already exists. Leah placed the boxes on the table. He's panicking. Kendall stood and opened the first box carefully. Payroll reports, vendor contracts, inventory ledgers, years of operational history. Leah lowered her voice. There's more. She handed Kendall a sealed envelope. Inside sat printed email chains. Kendall scanned the pages silently. Then slower. Ethan communicating with board members privately, pushing narratives, questioning Kendall's outdated leadership, suggesting Brooks' table needed cleaner executive optics before acquisition. One line stood out immediately. Savannah won't move unless Kendall is isolated first. Kendall reread that sentence twice, not because it shocked him, because it confirmed timing. Everything had been coordinated long before the firing. Leah watched him carefully. You okay? Kendall folded the papers neatly. Yes, the answer sounded calm, but Leah had known him 11 years. She recognized the difference between calm and emotional shutdown. Savannah knows about the shell companies, she asked quietly. Kendall took several seconds before answering. I honestly don't know anymore. That uncertainty bothered him most. Not the fraud, not the firing, Savannah's silence, her willingness to stop questioning Ethan, her willingness to stop questioning anything. Margaret interrupted gently. We need to file immediately. Kendall looked toward her. How aggressive emergency injunction against transaction completion, independent forensic audit request, preservation orders on all financial records. Leah exhaled softly. That'll freeze the Westbridge deal. Yes, Margaret replied, which is exactly why Ethan will fight hard. Kendall walked slowly toward the rain-covered windows. Below them, downtown Nashville glowed through blurred traffic lights and wet pavement reflections. 11 years. 11 years building Brooks' table from leaking food truck equipment and handwritten inventory sheets. 11 years solving problems before anyone else even saw them coming. And now strangers in expensive suits believed they could erase him with one boardroom meeting. Margaret stepped beside him. You understand what happens next, right? Yes. This becomes public eventually. Kendall nodded once. His reflection in the glass looked older tonight, more tired, but strangely clearer too, because once betrayal fully revealed itself, confusion disappeared with it. Only decisions remained. Margaret continued carefully. If we do this correctly, the law protects you. Kendall almost smiled faintly at that. People underestimated systems because systems move slowly, but Kendall trusted systems more than emotions. Systems created records. Records created truth. And truth survived longer than performance. He turned back toward the conference table. File everything. Margaret studied him one final moment. No hesitation, Kendall looked at the boxes of evidence stacked across the room. Then at the operating agreement everyone forgot existed. Then at the email still lying open beneath fluorescent light. Savannah won't move unless Kendall is isolated first. Finally, he answered quietly. They already decided who I was. His voice remained low, steady, controlled, so now they get to find out who they pushed out, and somewhere across Nashville, inside the glowing headquarters of Brooks' Table. Ethan Cole still believed the quiet man had already lost. Margaret Holloway filed the injunction request at 8:17 the next morning. By 8:42, 3 attorneys representing Brooks' Table were already calling her office, demanding clarification. By 9:05, Ethan Cole started calling Kendall directly. Kendall never answered. He sat inside Margaret's conference room wearing the same navy coat from the previous day, while reviewing transaction timelines spread across a 12-foot table. Color-coded folders divided everything into categories: vendor fraud, board negligence, acquisition exposure, improper approvals. Kendall organized crises the way engineers organize structural failures, layer by layer. No panic, just sequence. Margaret entered carrying fresh coffee and a stack of court filings. Judge Walker granted emergency review for tomorrow afternoon, she said. That fast. The acquisition value accelerated everything. Kendall nodded once. Large deals created urgency because large deals created liability, especially when fraud appeared connected to executive leadership. Margaret placed another folder beside him. You officially triggered forensic audit protections under the operating agreement. What's Brooks' Table arguing that you're acting emotionally after termination? Kendall almost smiled. Predictable. Margaret sat across from him carefully. They'll try to paint you as unstable, bitter ex-husband, disgruntled former employee. I expected that. You need to remain exactly like this. Kendall looked up. Like what, calm? Outside the conference room windows, downtown Nashville moved through another gray morning of traffic and rain. Inside, Kendall reviewed spreadsheets while his phone continued vibrating silently against the table. 23 missed calls already, mostly Ethan. 2 from Savannah, 1 from Richard Bennett. Kendall ignored everyone, not out of anger, out of discipline. Emotional conversations created mistakes. Documents did not. Around noon, Leah Turner arrived with additional internal records hidden inside plain storage binders. She closed the conference room door behind her immediately. They're shredding departments over there, she said. Margaret looked up sharply, meaning Ethan's locking people out of systems, replacing approval chains, trying to clean vendor records. Kendall's eyes hardened slightly. That mattered. Attempting record manipulation after legal notice created serious exposure. What about backups, he asked. Leah nodded. I copied everything you requested before they changed permissions. She slid a flash drive across the table. Kendall plugged it into his laptop immediately. More internal communications appeared. Scheduling logs, board meeting notes, private executive calendar records. Then another email stopped him cold. Subject line: transition strategy. Ethan to Richard Bennett. Savannah remains hesitant. Once Kendall is removed from operational control, the Westbridge closing becomes much easier. Kendall read the sentence twice, then once more, slower, not because it surprised him anymore, because it confirmed intent. This was never restructuring. It was removal. Leah watched his expression carefully. You okay? Kendall closed the laptop gently. Yes. Again, the same calm answer. But Leah noticed something new now, not sadness, distance. Like Kendall had emotionally stepped outside Brooks' Table already and was observing it from somewhere colder. Margaret read the email next. Well, she said quietly, that's ugly. Kendall leaned back slowly. Not ugly enough yet. Margaret studied him for a second. You already know there's more. Yes. How Kendall folded his hands together. People stealing money always rush once they think oversight disappears. Leah frowned. You think Ethan accelerated transfers after the firing? I know he did. Kendall opened another spreadsheet. Fresh transaction activity from less than 12 hours earlier. 3 emergency payments approved overnight, nearly $600,000 combined. Vendor descriptions vague, routing structures identical. Margaret cursed softly under her breath. That's panic movement. Kendall nodded once. He thinks the audit hasn't reached the court yet. The room fell quiet again. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Nashville's skyline looked blurred beneath low clouds. Kendall stared at the transaction record silently. 11 years building Brooks' table. 11 years protecting margins, contracts, payroll, expansion structures. And now, in less than a month, Ethan was bleeding the company through hidden channels, while Savannah remained focused on branding campaigns and acquisition dinners. The betrayal itself hurt less than the carelessness. That was the part Kendall couldn't stop thinking about. Savannah used to review every supplier contract beside him at the kitchen table. Now she signed $500,000 approvals without reading the second page. Around 2:30 p.m., Margaret's assistant entered the conference room. There's someone downstairs asking for Kendall. Who's Savannah Brooks? Silence. Leah immediately looked toward Kendall. Margaret removed her glasses slowly. You want me to send her away? Kendall stared toward the rain-covered windows for several seconds before answering. No. 5 minutes later, Savannah entered the conference room wearing a camel-colored coat and dark sunglasses despite the weather outside. She looked exhausted, not physically, pressured. The room changed the moment she walked in. Not dramatic tension, something older, more personal. Margaret stood politely. I'll give you 10 minutes. Then she and Leah quietly left the room. Savannah remained standing after the door closed. Kendall. He gestured calmly toward the empty chair across from him. She sat slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain filled the silence between them. Finally, Savannah looked toward the folders covering the conference table. So it's true. Kendall didn't answer immediately. What part? The injunction. Yes. Savannah removed her sunglasses. You're freezing the Westbridge deal. I'm freezing unauthorized financial exposure. Her jaw tightened. This could destroy everything. Kendall looked directly at her for the first time since the firing. No, he said quietly. The fraud could destroy everything. Savannah looked away immediately. That's Ethan's department. That's your signature. The words landed heavily. Not loud, not cruel, precise. Savannah exhaled sharply. You really think I'd knowingly steal from my own company? Kendall studied her carefully. And for the first time in weeks, something painful moved beneath his calm exterior, because despite everything, he still wanted the answer to be no. I think he said carefully, you stopped paying attention to who you trusted. Savannah stared down at the table silently. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Finally, she spoke again. Ethan said you were trying to control the company. Kendall almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, because it was strategically perfect. The quiet operations guy always looked controlling once charismatic people wanted him removed. I spent 11 years preventing disasters, he replied. That's different from control. Savannah rubbed her forehead slowly. You should have come to me directly. Kendall's expression barely changed. I tried. That answer hit harder than accusation, because it was true. The invoices, the questions, the warnings. Savannah simply stopped listening once Ethan convinced her caution was weakness. She looked around the conference room now, at the evidence boxes, at the spreadsheets, at the organized timelines, the invisible machinery Kendall had carried for years. When did you start building a case? She asked quietly. Kendall answered honestly. The moment I realized you trusted him more than the numbers. Silence again. Savannah looked genuinely shaken now, not because of the lawsuit, because she was finally seeing the scale of preparation sitting across from her. Kendall had not reacted impulsively. He had prepared quietly, systematically, like he prepared for every crisis since the food truck days. Savannah stood slowly from the chair. You're really doing this? Kendall remained seated. Yes. Even if it destroys Brooks. Table Kendall's voice stayed calm. If Brooks' table survives fraud, it survives. Another silence. Then Savannah picked up her sunglasses and turned toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped. I never wanted this. Kendall looked down at the operating agreement beside his hands. Neither did he. But wanting stopped mattering once evidence started existing. After Savannah left, Margaret returned several minutes later. Well, Kendall closed another folder carefully. She still thinks this is emotional. Margaret nodded knowingly. Most people mistake calm men for harmless men. Kendall said nothing, because tomorrow afternoon inside Davidson County Court, everyone involved was finally going to discover the difference. The launch gala for Brooks Table's National Frozen Meal line began at exactly 7 p.m. inside the ballroom of the Hermitage Hotel in downtown Nashville. Everything about the event was designed to look expensive. Crystal chandeliers, black and gold floral arrangements, custom ice sculptures shaped like the Brooks Table logo. Servers in tailored uniforms moved through the ballroom carrying smoked short rib sliders and bourbon-glazed shrimp skewers beneath soft jazz music. Television crews crowded near the main stage. Regional investors filled the front tables. Food influencers filmed everything for social media before even tasting the food. The entire evening felt less like a restaurant launch and more like a corporate coronation. Savannah Brooks entered the ballroom at 7:18 p.m. The room reacted instantly. Cameras lifted. People stood. Conversations shifted toward her like metal toward a magnet. She wore a fitted black evening dress with diamond earrings provided by a luxury jewelry sponsor from Dallas. Ethan Cole walked beside her in a midnight blue tuxedo, speaking confidently to reporters before questions even formed. Kendall Diaz watched all of it from across the street, inside his parked Ford Explorer. Rain slid slowly down the windshield while valet attendants rushed luxury vehicles beneath the hotel entrance awning. Margaret Holloway sat in the passenger seat reviewing court documents one final time under the dashboard light. You still have time to delay this, she said calmly. Kendall kept his eyes on the glowing hotel windows. No. Margaret closed the folder. You understand what tonight becomes after service. Yes, media attention, investor panic, board exposure. Kendall nodded once. That part no longer bothered him, because once companies started protecting image over truth, collapse became inevitable anyway. The only question was timing. Across the street, photographers crowded around Savannah near the ballroom entrance. Ethan stood close enough to enter every frame beside her. That detail didn't escape Kendall. Ethan was positioning himself publicly now, not just as consultant, as leadership, as the future face beside Savannah. Margaret watched Kendall quietly. You okay, Kendall answered without looking away from the hotel. I used to carry extension cords into food festivals with her. Margaret said nothing, because some losses sounded too personal once spoken aloud. At 7:42 p.m., Kendall finally stepped out of the SUV. Cold rain drifted lightly across Broadway while downtown traffic reflected against wet pavement beneath hotel lights. He wore the same navy suit from his firing meeting. No designer tailoring, no media polish, just clean lines and quiet precision. Margaret walked beside him carrying a slim leather case filled with injunction documents and forensic filing notices. Near the entrance, several guests recognized Kendall immediately. Conversations lowered. Whispers moved quickly. Most people attending the gala already heard rumors about internal disputes at Brooks' table. But rumors felt different once the quiet man everyone underestimated suddenly appeared in person. Inside the ballroom, Savannah stood on stage thanking investors, while giant digital screens behind her displayed promotional footage of frozen meal packaging entering grocery stores nationwide. Applause echoed through the room. Ethan smiled proudly near the front tables. This partnership with Westbridge Foods Savannah announced represents the beginning of a new era for Brooks' Table. The phrase lingered strangely in Kendall's mind. A new era. Maybe she really believed that. Maybe Ethan convinced her the past was something to outgrow. Kendall stopped near the ballroom entrance while event staff stared uncertainly at him. Nobody approached. Nobody asked him to leave because technically, he still owned 38% of the company being celebrated. Margaret checked her watch. Ready? Kendall nodded once. A process server wearing a dark raincoat entered the ballroom behind them, carrying an official court envelope. Timing mattered. Public settings mattered, especially when corporate leadership spent months prioritizing appearance. The process server crossed directly toward the stage while Savannah continued speaking beneath bright camera lights. At first, most guests assumed he belonged to event staff. Then Savannah noticed the envelope. Her sentence stopped halfway through. The ballroom quieted immediately. Ethan stood abruptly from his chair. "What is this?" he snapped. The process server remained professional. "Ms. Brooks, you are hereby served notice regarding emergency injunction proceedings filed in Davidson County Court." Camera flashes exploded instantly across the room. Guests started whispering loudly now. Phones appeared everywhere. Savannah stared at the documents in visible confusion while Ethan moved quickly toward her. "This is inappropriate," he barked. Margaret stepped forward calmly. "No, Mr. Cole, it's procedural." That was when people finally noticed Kendall standing near the ballroom entrance, still, silent, watching, and suddenly the emotional temperature inside the room changed completely because the quiet husband they thought had disappeared had just frozen a national acquisition in the middle of its celebration event. Richard Bennett approached first, face pale beneath ballroom lighting. "Kendall," he said carefully, "this isn't the place." Kendall's voice remained level. Neither was the boardroom. Richard flinched slightly. Nearby investors started checking phones immediately. Westbridge representatives whispered urgently among themselves near the VYP tables. Ethan walked toward Kendall with controlled fury barely hidden beneath his polished expression. "You've lost your mind." Kendall looked at him calmly. "No, I found your wire transfers." For the first time since entering Brooks' table, Ethan Cole's confidence cracked visibly, only for a second. But Kendall saw it, and once fear entered rooms like this, it spread fast. Savannah stepped down from the stage, slowly, still holding the legal documents in one hand. "Kendall," she said quietly, "please." That word again. Please. Not during the firing, not during the restructuring, only now, only once consequences arrived publicly. Margaret opened her leather case and handed copies of the injunction notice directly to Westbridge legal representatives. The lead attorney scanned the first page rapidly, then looked toward Savannah. "Is there an active fraud allegation tied to company finances?" Nobody answered quickly enough. That was answer enough. Within minutes, the ballroom no longer sounded celebratory. It sounded unstable. Investors gathered into nervous circles. Board members whispered aggressively near the bar. Media crews repositioned instantly away from promotional footage and toward legal paperwork. Savannah stood near center stage, looking suddenly isolated beneath the massive digital Brooks table logo behind her. Kendall noticed she looked smaller tonight. Not weaker, just unprotected. Because for years he had handled disasters before they reached her publicly. Tonight he didn't. Ethan attempted damage control almost immediately. "This is a personal dispute being weaponized," he announced loudly toward several investors. Nothing more. Kendall reached into his coat pocket calmly, then handed one document directly to Richard Bennett. Bank transfer summaries, highlighted routing structures, Florida holding company connections. Richard's face drained of color almost instantly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. Ethan noticed the reaction, so did everyone nearby, and panic started moving faster now. Westbridge executives quietly exited toward private conference rooms with their legal teams. Sponsors began leaving. Publicists started making phone calls. The illusion cracked in real time. Kendall never raised his voice once, never insulted Savannah publicly, never made speeches, He simply brought documents into a room built entirely on appearance, and documents always weighed more. Near the ballroom entrance, Leah Turner arrived carrying additional audit binders requested by Margaret earlier that afternoon. She stopped beside Kendall quietly. "You just detonated the entire launch," she whispered. Kendall watched another group of investors hurry toward the exits. "No," he replied calmly. Then he looked toward Ethan. The fraud did. Across the ballroom, Savannah finally opened the injunction packet fully. Her eyes moved line by line. Audit request. Transaction freeze. Forensic accounting review. Emergency governance hearing. And beneath it all, Kendall Diaz listed not as former employee, but as co-founder. The room no longer saw him the same way after that. Neither did Savannah. Westbridge Foods froze the acquisition at 9:12 the next morning. Not delayed, not postponed, frozen. The official notice arrived through email first, then through legal courier 30 minutes later at Brooks Table headquarters. All transaction activity connected to the National Distribution Agreement stopped immediately pending forensic review. Inside the executive offices downtown, panic spread faster than anyone admitted publicly. Investors began calling non-stop. Regional managers demanded answers. Media outlets started requesting statements after footage from the Hermitage Gala leaked online overnight. By sunrise, clips of Savannah Brooks being served legal papers during her own launch event had already spread across social media. The headlines were brutal. Celebrity chef faces fraud allegations before major acquisition. Co-founder freezes Brooks table deal. Inside Nashville's fastest-growing restaurant scandal. Kendall Diaz read every article from Margaret Holloway's conference room while drinking black coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. He didn't react emotionally to any of it. Public narratives changed constantly. Documents mattered more. Margaret entered carrying another stack of filings around 8 a.m. "The board called an emergency session," she said. Kendall looked up from his laptop. "When 10 o'clock. At headquarters, Margaret nodded. "And they requested your presence." Kendall closed the laptop slowly. "That means Richard finally read the transfers." "Yes." Margaret studied him carefully. "You understand Ethan's going to attack credibility now. He already started. Several anonymous media leaks overnight painted Kendall as a jealous husband trying to sabotage Savannah's success after being removed from leadership. Predictable. Kendall expected that strategy the moment Ethan realized financial evidence existed. Character assassination always arrived before financial defense when guilty people ran out of explanations. Margaret slid printed screenshots across the table. Anonymous insider claims Kendall struggled emotionally with Savannah's fame. Sources close to Brooks' table describe controlling behavior. "He's building a narrative," Margaret said. Kendall scanned the articles once before pushing them aside. "Then we stay with records." That answer almost made Margaret smile. Most people under public attack wanted revenge immediately. Kendall wanted timelines. At 9:45 a.m., they entered Brooks' Table headquarters through the underground parking garage to avoid media gathered outside the main entrance. Camera crews already lined the sidewalks despite the rain. Reporters shouted questions toward anyone entering the building. "Mr. Diaz, are you accusing Savannah Brooks directly? Is Brooks' Table under federal investigation? Did Ethan Cole steal company funds?" Kendall ignored all of them, not because he lacked answers, because public emotion complicated legal precision. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt completely different from only 1 week earlier. Employees whispered openly now. Phones rang constantly. Several executive assistants looked close to tears. The illusion of stability had collapsed overnight. Kendall noticed small details immediately. Security personnel stationed outside finance offices. Temporary access restrictions on internal systems. Boxes stacked outside Ethan's media department. Damage control. Panic management. Too late. Richard Bennett waited inside the main conference room alongside board attorneys and 2 representatives from Westbridge Foods. Savannah sat near the far end of the table wearing a dark gray suit with almost no makeup. She looked exhausted. Ethan Cole stood near the window speaking aggressively into his phone before the meeting began. The moment he saw Kendall enter, he ended the call instantly. Good, Kendall thought. Fear was finally replacing arrogance. Margaret sat beside Kendall while arranging legal documents methodically across the table. Richard cleared his throat heavily. Let's begin. Nobody touched the catered breakfast trays sitting untouched near the wall. Richard looked directly at Kendall first. You're alleging significant financial misconduct connected to Brooks' table executive operations. Kendall answered calmly. Yes. Ethan immediately leaned forward. Based on manipulated interpretations of vendor structures. No, Kendall replied evenly. Based on bank transfers. That landed harder, because facts sounded heavier than accusations. Richard rubbed his forehead. Westbridge Legal reviewed preliminary evidence this morning. One of the Westbridge attorneys spoke next. We identified multiple undisclosed consulting relationships tied to shell entities. Savannah finally looked toward Ethan, only briefly, but Kendall noticed it immediately. Trust weakening, not emotionally, structurally. Ethan straightened his posture. These are standard strategic consulting arrangements. Kendall opened a folder quietly, then slid 3 documents across the table. Transfer logs, LLC ownership records, payment routing summaries. All 3 vendors route through financial entities connected to your brother Daniel Cole, Kendall said. Silence. Real silence this time. Not uncomfortable. Dangerous. Ethan's expression tightened immediately. That proves nothing. It proves disclosure failure, Margaret interrupted sharply, which is already enough to trigger audit escalation. Westbridge's lead attorney adjusted his glasses while reading the documents. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, were these relationships disclosed during acquisition review? Ethan hesitated, tiny hesitation, but enough. Richard saw it too. So did Savannah. No, Ethan admitted finally, because they weren't material. Kendall leaned back slightly. $2.3 million is material. Nobody spoke after that. Rain hammered against the giant conference room windows overlooking downtown Nashville. The city below looked blurred beneath low gray clouds. Savannah stared at the transfer documents in front of her now, not at Kendall, not at Ethan, at the numbers. Maybe for the first time in years. Richard finally broke the silence. Why wasn't finance review involved in these approvals? Ethan answered immediately. Kendall slowed every growth initiative. He slowed risk exposure, Margaret corrected. Ethan's calmness started slipping now. He was obsessed with control. Kendall's expression never moved. No, he said quietly. I was obsessed with records. That sentence stayed in the room because everyone sitting there suddenly understood the difference. Control relied on power, records relied on proof, and proof was winning. Savannah finally spoke softly. Ethan, tell me this isn't what it looks like. Kendall didn't look at her after she said it because he already knew the answer. Ethan shifted strategies instantly, classic survival instinct. This is being exaggerated because Kendall couldn't handle restructuring. Westbridge's attorney interrupted coldly. We don't freeze $90 million acquisitions over emotional disputes, Mr. Cole. That shut him up. Richard Bennett stood and walked toward the windows slowly. The chairman suddenly looked much older than he had during the firing meeting. How bad is this legally? He asked Margaret. She answered without hesitation. If fraud is confirmed, potential civil liability, fiduciary breaches, investor exposure, possibly federal review, depending on fund movement. Another silence followed. Then Kendall calmly placed one final document onto the table. Forensic Accounting Preliminary Review. Prepared overnight. Highlighted in yellow were 18 suspicious transactions executed after Kendall's firing. Rapid emergency payments, unusual routing changes, attempted data modifications. Margaret watched Ethan carefully as Richard read through the report. The reaction came immediately. "You moved money yesterday," Richard snapped. Ethan's composure cracked completely for the first time. "We needed operational flexibility." "You started moving funds after legal notice," Margaret said flatly. "That's catastrophic." Savannah finally looked directly at Ethan now, and Kendall saw something disappear from her face. Not love, not loyalty, certainty, because certainty only survived until numbers arrived. Ethan stood abruptly from his chair. "This entire company exists because I modernized it." Kendall remained seated. "No," he replied quietly. The room turned toward him. Kendall folded his hands together calmly. "This company exists because people spent 11 years protecting it before you arrived. No dramatic speech, no shouting, just truth delivered without emotion, and somehow that hit harder than anger ever could." Richard lowered himself back into his chair slowly. "What happens now?" Margaret answered immediately. "Independent forensic audit, immediate suspension of unauthorized transfers, preservation of all executive communications." Westbridge's attorney nodded. "Our acquisition remains frozen until further notice." The deal was officially dying, at least temporarily. Ethan looked around the room, realizing support had started evaporating. Board members no longer defended him. Westbridge no longer trusted him. Even Savannah remained silent now. Kendall noticed Ethan's hands shaking slightly near the edge of the conference table. Interesting, because guilty people always lost control once systems replaced narratives, and Kendall trusted systems more than people. As the meeting dissolved into legal discussions and emergency planning, Kendall quietly gathered his folders. He had no interest in victory speeches. The numbers already spoke loudly enough. But just before leaving the room, Richard Bennett stopped him. "Kendall." He turned. Richard looked genuinely ashamed now. "We should have listened earlier." Kendall studied the exhausted faces around the conference room one final time, then answered with the same calm voice he always used. "You stopped listening to the wrong things." And behind him, at the far end of the table, Ethan Cole finally looked afraid. The forensic audit began on a Monday morning inside a temporary legal workspace 3 blocks away from the Davidson County Courthouse. No cameras, no investors, no celebrity branding. Just fluorescent lights, locked file cabinets, folding tables, and 6 accountants surrounded by 12 years of financial records. Kendall Diaz preferred rooms like this, rooms where performance stopped mattering. Numbers behaved differently under fluorescent light. They became colder, more honest. Margaret Holloway converted the largest conference room into an audit center over the weekend. Whiteboards lined the walls filled with transaction timelines and vendor connections. Printed bank statements sat stacked in color-coded boxes labeled by year. The history of Brooks' table laid out like a crime scene. Kendall arrived before everyone else at 6:20 a.m., carrying coffee and a laptop bag. He wore another plain button-down shirt, no expensive watch, no legal entourage, just paperwork. One of the forensic accountants looked up as Kendall entered. "You already indexed the transfers for us," Kendall nodded once. "By routing sequence and approval chain." The accountant blinked. "You did that yourself?" "Yes." Most people underestimated how deeply Kendall understood the company because they confused visibility with value. Savannah appeared on magazine covers. Kendall knew where every dollar had traveled since the food truck days. That mattered now. By 8 a.m., the room filled with attorneys, accountants, and compliance specialists reviewing records in tense silence. Printers hummed constantly. Highlighters scratched across paper. Coffee cups multiplied beside laptops. And slowly, piece by piece, the illusion surrounding Brooks' table started collapsing under documentation. One accountant raised his hand first around mid-morning. "We found duplicate consulting invoices." Another voice followed. "These vendor addresses overlap." Then another. "Several contracts were approved without secondary financial review." Margaret moved through the room calmly, taking notes, while Kendall remained seated near the far wall reviewing transaction summaries. He rarely interrupted anyone. Didn't need to. The records spoke loudly enough. Around 10:30, Savannah entered the audit room for the first time. Conversations lowered immediately, not because she demanded attention, because she looked completely different here than she did under television lighting. No glam team, no interviews, no stage. Just a gray coat, tied back hair, and visible exhaustion beneath her eyes. She paused near the doorway, quietly taking in the scene around her. The stacks of records, the highlighted transfers, the forensic charts, the reality. Kendall noticed she looked toward him instinctively first. He remained seated, still reviewing documents, not avoiding her, just working. Margaret approached Savannah carefully. "We're still processing records." Savannah nodded slowly. "Can I see the transfer reports?" Margaret handed her a binder without speaking. Savannah sat alone near the end of the room, turning pages quietly, while accountants continued working around her. Kendall didn't watch her directly, but he noticed small details anyway. The way she stopped longer on certain signatures, the way her breathing changed reading approval logs, the way her shoulders stiffened seeing how many documents carried her electronic authorization, not forged, not fabricated, signed by her. That mattered legally, even if she never understood what she approved. Around noon, another discovery changed the room completely. A forensic analyst projected transaction mapping onto the conference room wall. Colored lines connected shell vendors through multiple holding companies. Then all paths converged toward two linked financial entities in Florida. One registered directly under Daniel Cole, Ethan's younger brother. The room went silent immediately. The analyst pointed toward the projection. Total undocumented exposure currently estimated at approximately $3.1 million. Savannah looked physically sick hearing the number. Margaret folded her arms. "And that figure may increase." Kendall sat quietly near the back of the room. No satisfaction crossed his face. Because this wasn't victory, it was damage assessment. That difference mattered deeply to him. One accountant approached Kendall privately during lunch break. "How long did you suspect this?" Kendall looked toward the whiteboards covered in timelines. "About 4 months. You could have exposed it earlier." "Yes, why didn't you?" Kendall answered honestly. "Because accusations without complete records become noise." The accountant stared at him for a second, then nodded slowly. That answer explained everything about Kendall Diaz. He never moved fast emotionally. He moved correctly. Around 1:45 p.m., Leah Turner arrived carrying archived operational files from a storage facility outside Nashville. "Found more approval records," she said, while setting down boxes. Kendall stood immediately to help organize them. Leah lowered her voice. "Employees are freaking out." "At headquarters?" "Yeah. Vendors are nervous. Payroll staff thinks bankruptcy rumors are real." Kendall frowned slightly. "Payroll will clear." "Yes, good." That was where his mind went first. Not reputation, not revenge. Employees, always employees. Because while Savannah built a brand and Ethan built appearances, Kendall built systems that fed families. Line cooks, dishwashers, truck drivers. Payroll mattered more than headlines. Leah studied him carefully. "You still care about the company?" Kendall opened another archive box slowly. "I care about the people inside it." That answer stayed with her. Later that afternoon, the audit uncovered something worse than stolen money. Email chains, internal communication between Ethan and outside vendors, discussing how to bypass Kendall's approval systems before the Westbridge acquisition finalized. One message froze the room completely. Once the deal closes, Kendall's protections disappear anyway. Savannah never saw that email before. Kendall noticed immediately. Her expression changed. Not dramatic, not explosive, something quieter. Recognition, like she was finally seeing how carefully Ethan manipulated the structure around her while she focused on visibility and growth. Margaret handed the printed email directly to Savannah. "You need to read all of it." Savannah did, slowly. Every line, every timestamp, every strategy discussion about isolating Kendall from financial oversight. Nobody spoke while she read. Even the accountants worked more quietly now. Kendall remained seated across the room, reviewing payroll reserve calculations. He didn't watch Savannah emotionally unravel. That wasn't who he was, and honestly, part of him no longer had energy for anger, only clarity. Near evening, Richard Bennett arrived unexpectedly, carrying another folder of board records. He looked exhausted, older than before. "We found deleted communication attempts," he admitted quietly. Margaret looked up sharply. "Deleted by who?" "Ethan's department." Richard handed over printed server recovery reports. Several internal warnings Kendall submitted months earlier had been removed from executive review chains before board meetings. The room grew still again, because now negligence looked deliberate. Richard finally looked toward Kendall directly. "You tried to warn us." Kendall nodded once. "Yes." Richard rubbed his forehead heavily. "I thought you were resisting change." Kendall answered calmly. "I was resisting theft. No bitterness, no triumph, just precision." Savannah sat motionless nearby, holding the email printouts with both hands now. Kendall noticed her wedding ring still on her finger. Strange what details people observed during collapse. Around 6 p.m., most accountants finally left for the evening. Only a few remained finishing transaction summaries. The room looked exhausted now. Coffee stains, loose paperwork, half-empty legal pads. Margaret approached Kendall near the windows overlooking downtown Nashville. "You know what happens after this, right?" "Yes, Ethan won't survive it." Kendall stared down at the traffic below. "That's his problem." Margaret studied him carefully. "You really don't hate him?" Kendall thought about that, then answered honestly. "Hate wastes concentration." Outside, Nashville glowed beneath cold evening rain. Inside the audit room, 11 years of hidden labor finally sat visible on tables for everyone to see. The systems, the protections, the warnings, everything Kendall built quietly behind the scenes while others chased attention, and somewhere in the middle of all those records, Savannah Brooks was finally beginning to understand who had truly carried Brooks' table all those years. Ethan Cole stopped wearing tailored suits after the second week of the audit. Kendall noticed that first, not because he cared about fashion, because pressure always revealed itself through small details before collapse became public. The expensive silk ties disappeared, then the polished confidence, then the controlled smile Ethan used during investor meetings and television interviews. By the third week, he looked like a man sleeping badly inside borrowed offices, and the forensic accountants were only getting started. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon at 3:16 p.m. One of the analysts from Nashville Financial Crimes Review entered the audit room carrying a fresh stack of bank routing reports. "We found the consolidation account," she announced. Every conversation inside the room stopped instantly. Margaret Holloway stood first. "Show me." The analyst spread the documents across the center conference table beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Layered transfers from multiple consulting vendors, 3 shell companies, 2 holding accounts. Then finally, one destination account connected through a Florida investment entity partially controlled by Daniel Cole, Ethan's brother. Total undocumented exposure now exceeded $4.4 million. Kendall studied the routing maps silently. No reaction, no satisfaction, just confirmation. Because by now the emotional part of betrayal had already burned away inside him. Only structure remained. Margaret pointed toward a highlighted sequence. These transfers accelerated immediately after Kendall's termination. The analyst nodded. Almost triple the previous movement rate. Panic transfers. Kendall expected that. People stealing slowly often became reckless once oversight disappeared. Leah Turner looked physically sick, reading the numbers. Jesus. Another accountant spoke quietly from the back of the room. "There's more." He connected his laptop to the wall monitor. Recovered internal emails appeared across the screen. private communication between Ethan and outside consultants, strategy discussions, deletion instructions, and one message time-stamped 9 days before Kendall's firing. We remove Kendall first. The old systems disappear with him. Silence filled the room, heavy silence, the kind that changed companies permanently. Richard Bennett sat near the far wall with both elbows resting on the table now. The chairman looked exhausted beyond words. "How did we miss this?" he muttered quietly. Kendall answered without emotion. "You stopped auditing the right people." Richard closed his eyes briefly, because he knew Kendall was right. The board became distracted by visibility. Celebrity interviews, expansion numbers, media attention. They stopped respecting the quiet systems underneath the company, and Ethan understood exactly how to exploit that. Savannah arrived 30 minutes later after canceling a national television appearance in New York. No cameras followed her anymore. That part had changed fast. The moment she entered the audit room, Margaret handed her the recovered emails without speaking. Savannah read them standing near the doorway, one by one, slowly. Kendall remained seated across the room reviewing payroll reserve projections for the Nashville and Franklin locations. He focused there intentionally. Employees still needed checks cleared Friday. Truck vendors still required payment schedules. Kitchen staff still showed up before dawn. The company continued existing beneath the scandal. That mattered to him more than appearances. Savannah finally lowered the papers. Her hands trembled slightly. "When did you recover these server reconstruction finished this morning?" Margaret replied. Savannah looked toward Kendall then, not dramatically, not emotionally, like someone finally seeing the actual shape of a disaster. "You knew," she said quietly. Kendall looked up from the spreadsheets. "Yes, how long? Long enough." That answer hurt more than accusation, because Savannah understood exactly what it meant. Kendall spent months watching the company bleed while she ignored warning signs standing directly in front of her. The room remained painfully quiet. Then Richard Bennett spoke. "We're terminating Ethan immediately." Nobody argued, not even Savannah, because evidence removed debate. That was why Kendall trusted records more than conversations. Facts survived emotion. At 5:40 p.m., Ethan Cole entered the audit room for what became the last executive meeting of his career. He still tried walking in confidently, still carried himself like the room belonged to him, but Kendall noticed the details immediately. Sweat beneath the collar despite cold air conditioning, uneven breathing, slight tremor in his right hand, fear. Richard Bennett stood before Ethan, even sat down. "We recovered the transfer structures." Ethan's expression didn't change fast enough. That hesitation alone confirmed everything. "You're making assumptions based on consulting routing," he replied carefully. Margaret slid printed records across the table. "Your brother's company received direct benefit from undisclosed transactions." Ethan glanced at the papers, then toward Savannah, then toward Kendall. Finally, he attempted the last strategy available, attack motive. "This is because Kendall couldn't accept losing control," he snapped. "He poisoned all of you against me." Kendall stayed seated, still calm, still almost unnervingly composed. Margaret didn't even look at Ethan when she answered. "The bank records poisoned you." Ethan's jaw tightened hard. "You think this company survives without me?" Kendall finally spoke. "This company survived before you arrived." That landed harder than anyone expected, because it was true. Brooks' table existed long before Ethan attached himself to its spotlight. Ethan stepped closer toward the conference table. "You don't understand branding, national growth, public perception." Kendall met his eyes evenly. "No," he said quietly. "I understand payroll." Silence again. Kendall continued calmly. "I understand inventory margins, labor exposure, vendor leverage, tax risk, debt structure, every word precise, measured, cold. You understand attention." That was the difference between them, and suddenly everyone in the room could see it clearly. Ethan built appearances, Kendall built foundations. Richard Bennett finally straightened his posture. Your executive access is revoked, effective immediately. Ethan laughed once. Sharp, empty. You're all making a huge mistake. Margaret closed the legal folder in front of her. No, Mr. Cole. Then she looked directly at him. You already made it. Security escorted Ethan from the building less than 20 minutes later. No dramatic shouting, no physical struggle, just a disgraced executive carrying a leather bag through quiet hallways while employees pretended not to stare. Kendall watched none of it. He remained inside the audit room reviewing operational cash flow because payroll deadlines still existed. Leah noticed. You're not even going to watch him leave. Kendall shook his head once. It doesn't change anything, and honestly, it didn't. The damage already happened. Victory never interested him as much as stabilization. Around 7:00 p.m., the Westbridge Foods legal team requested a private meeting with Kendall. Not Savannah, not Richard Bennett. Kendall. That detail changed the room instantly. Inside a smaller conference office overlooking downtown Nashville, two Westbridge executives sat waiting beside stacks of acquisition paperwork. The senior representative spoke first. We're considering whether Brooks' table remains salvageable. Kendall sat across from them calmly. It is, you sound certain. The operational structure still works. What about leadership? Kendall paused briefly. Interesting question, because for 11 years he answered it privately without recognition. Now people were finally asking openly. The employees know how to operate, he replied. Most systems remain stable. The executive leaned forward slightly. And if we asked you to return temporarily during restructuring, Kendall didn't answer immediately. Rain streaked softly down the conference room windows behind them. Downtown Nashville glowed beneath cold evening traffic. The irony of the moment settled quietly inside him. 3 weeks ago they pushed him out like obsolete paperwork. Now the same people needed the systems only he fully understood. The executive continued carefully. We trust your records, Mr. Diaz. That sentence mattered more than they realized, because Kendall spent most of his life being underestimated precisely because he wasn't loud, not charismatic, not visible enough. But systems trusted him, records trusted him, truth trusted him, and eventually that became stronger than image. Outside the conference room, Savannah stood alone in the dark hallway, holding the recovered email printouts while employees avoided eye contact walking past her. For the first time since Brooks' table became famous, she no longer looked like the most powerful person in the building. Savannah Brooks asked Kendall to meet her 3 days after Ethan Cole was removed from Brooks' table. Not at headquarters, not at the audit office, at Harrington's Steakhouse near Music Row, the same restaurant where they celebrated opening the first Brooks' table location nearly 8 years earlier. Kendall almost declined, not because he hated her, because exhaustion had finally reached him, the kind that settled deep behind the ribs after carrying too much responsibility for too long. But Margaret Holloway advised him to go. Closure matters in negotiations, she said. Kendall arrived at 7:05 p.m. The restaurant smelled like bourbon-grilled steak and polished wood. Soft jazz drifted through dim lighting while executives and attorneys filled corner booths speaking quietly over expensive wine. Savannah already sat near the back of the dining room when he entered. No publicist, no assistants, no cameras, just Savannah. For a moment, seeing her there almost blurred time backward, back to the food truck years, back before branding teams and investor dinners and national interviews, back when they sat at folding tables planning survival month by month. But memory and reality were different things. Kendall took the seat across from her calmly. Savannah looked tired, not physically, emotionally stripped down, like someone who spent weeks realizing how much noise surrounded her life once the spotlight started disappearing. A waiter approached immediately. Kendall ordered black coffee. Nothing else. Savannah noticed. You used to order ribeye here. Kendall folded his hands quietly. I used to sleep more, too. That landed softly between them. Not cruel, just true. For several seconds, neither spoke. Rain streaked slowly down the restaurant windows outside while muted conversations filled the background around them. Finally, Savannah exhaled. I fired Ethan yesterday officially. Kendall nodded once. I know. You knew before the board announced it. Yes. A faint, tired smile crossed her face. Of course you did. Kendall didn't respond, because there was nothing satisfying about being right this way. The waiter brought coffee. Savannah wrapped both hands around her glass of wine, but barely touched it. The forensic team says the losses may go higher. Kendall stirred nothing into the coffee. How much? Possibly $6 million after exposure review. He nodded slowly, not shocked, just calculating. Insurance coverage, liquidity pressure, vendor confidence, payroll sustainability. His mind still moved operationally even after everything. Savannah noticed that too. You're still thinking about the company. I'm thinking about the employees. That answer visibly affected her, because deep down Savannah understood something painful now. Kendall never built Brooks' table for ego. He built it because he believed stability protected people, and somewhere along the way she stopped valuing stability because excitement looked more impressive. Savannah finally looked directly at him. I made mistakes. Kendall remained quiet. No immediate forgiveness, no dramatic accusation. Just silence, allowing truth to sit where it belonged. Savannah continued carefully. I thought you were resisting growth. I was resisting recklessness. I know that now. The honesty sounded genuine. That made it harder somehow, because manipulation would have been simpler to hate. Instead, Savannah looked like someone slowly realizing how many years she spent overlooking the wrong things. The jazz music shifted softly overhead. Plates clinked somewhere near the kitchen. Outside Nashville, traffic reflected across wet streets beneath neon signs. Savannah lowered her eyes briefly. When did we become strangers? Kendall thought about the question seriously before answering. The moment success became louder than trust. She absorbed that quietly. No defense this time, no argument, because she knew exactly when it started too. The investor dinners, the celebrity branding, the endless pressure to look bigger, richer, faster. And Ethan Cole understood perfectly how to weaponize all of it. Savannah finally reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Kendall opened it slowly. Board proposal documents, temporary restructuring offers, executive reinstatement package, chief financial oversight authority, enhanced compensation, expanded equity recognition. Savannah watched him carefully. The board wants you back. Kendall kept reading silently. They trust you now, she added. Interesting sentence. Now, after collapse, after fraud, after public humiliation, trust arrived only after systems broke visibly enough for everyone else to notice who had been holding them together. Kendall closed the folder gently. No, Savannah blinked. No, I'm not coming back. The answer came calmly, immediately, like he already decided long before tonight. Savannah stared at him. But Brooks' table needs you. Kendall looked toward the rain-covered window beside them. Brooks' table needed me before. Silence again. Heavy this time, because Savannah finally understood the full cost of what happened. Not just financially, personally. She leaned forward slightly. We can fix this. Kendall's expression softened for the first time all evening. Not romantic softness. Sadness. Quiet disappointment. No, he said carefully. You can stabilize it. That's different. Savannah looked down at the untouched wine in front of her. I trusted the wrong person, Kendall answered honestly. You stopped trusting the right one. That sentence almost broke something in her face. But Kendall looked away before emotion fully surfaced there, because he couldn't survive this process by reopening old wounds now. Not after weeks of legal warfare and years of invisible exhaustion. Savannah spoke more quietly afterward. What do you want? That question mattered because everyone else assumed Kendall wanted revenge, control, power, public humiliation. But they never understood him correctly. Kendall opened another folder from his briefcase. Prepared already. Of course, prepared already. Inside sat structured buyout terms and governance conditions, employee protection clauses, operational stability requirements, long-term bonus guarantees for senior staff, vendor repayment schedules, public correction language acknowledging him officially as co-founder. Savannah stared at the paperwork silently. You already drafted everything. Yes, before tonight. Yes, again preparation instead of emotion. Always. Kendall finally met her eyes directly. I don't want Brooks' table destroyed. Then why leave? Because that question held the real wound underneath everything. Kendall took several seconds before answering. Because I spent 11 years building a company, he said quietly, and somewhere along the way I stopped having a place inside it. Savannah looked away immediately after hearing that. The restaurant noise around them suddenly felt distant, muted, small. Kendall continued calmly. I protected the company so hard that everyone eventually assumed it protected itself. The truth of that sat painfully between them. For years he handled crises before they reached her, quietly, completely, until Savannah forgot crises existed at all. She rubbed at her eyes briefly before speaking again. I never meant to erase you. Kendall believed her. That was the difficult part. Neglect sometimes damaged people just as deeply as cruelty, and Savannah neglected the foundation holding her life together until someone else exploited the gap. The waiter approached carefully, asking whether they wanted dinner menus. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Kendall shook his head. Just the check. Savannah looked startled by that, like she suddenly realized there would be no dramatic reconciliation tonight. No emotional rescue. No return to the old structure. Only consequences. The waiter left quietly. Savannah stared at the buyout documents one last time. You really planned every detail already. Kendall almost smiled faintly. That's what I've always done. And suddenly she understood something devastating. The systems, the protection, the preparation, the calm during disaster. That wasn't just Kendall's job. That was who he was. And she spent years standing beside it without fully seeing it. When the check arrived, Kendall paid without looking at the amount. Habit, predictability, structure. He stood slowly from the booth and buttoned his coat. Savannah remained seated, holding the buyout folder against the table. Kendall. He paused. For a second, she looked like the woman from the food truck years again. Tired, honest, uncertain. Not the celebrity, not the brand. Just Savannah. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Kendall stood still for a long moment, then nodded once. Not forgiveness, not rejection, just acknowledgement. Before leaving, he placed one final document on the table beside her wine glass. A payroll stabilization plan for Brooks' table employees during restructuring. Even now, after everything, he was still protecting the people inside the company. Then Kendall Diaz walked out into the cold Nashville rain alone. And for the first time in 11 years, he did not feel responsible for saving anyone behind him. The final agreement was signed on a gray Thursday morning inside the First Horizon Bank Tower overlooking downtown Nashville. No media attended, no photographers waited outside, no champagne sat on polished tables celebrating new beginnings. Just attorneys, financial binders, wire transfer confirmations, and the quiet sound of a company dividing itself apart. Kendall Diaz arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a single cardboard file box beneath one arm. The box looked almost absurdly small, considering 11 years of his life sat inside it. A framed photo from the original food truck, 3 notebooks filled with handwritten vendor calculations, an old Brooks table employee badge from 2014, and the Casio watch Savannah once joked looked older than the smoker. That was all he kept. Everything else stayed with the company. Margaret Holloway met him in the lobby beside the elevators. You sleep at all? she asked. Couple hours. You nervous? Kendall considered the question honestly. No. And he wasn't. Sad sometimes, tired constantly, but not nervous, because uncertainty disappeared once decisions finally became irreversible. Inside conference room 4-1B, legal teams already organized stacks of documents across a polished walnut table. Richard Bennett stood near the windows speaking quietly with Westbridge representatives. Savannah sat alone near the far end, reviewing the buyout agreement one final time. She looked thinner now. The past month had stripped away the polished certainty she used to carry into rooms. No glam squad, no designer branding team, no Ethan Cole orbiting nearby. Just silence and consequences. Kendall noticed she still wore her wedding ring. He noticed himself noticing it. Then deliberately looked away. Margaret pulled out a chair beside him. The final valuation came in stronger than expected, she whispered quietly. Kendall nodded once. The forensic audit ultimately proved something investors respected deeply. Brooks Table's operational core remained stable despite executive fraud exposure, because Kendall built redundancies into almost everything: cash reserves, vendor protections, insurance structures, debt containment. The company survived because he planned for disasters years before anyone imagined them. Westbridge Foods reduced acquisition terms significantly, but chose not to walk away entirely. That decision surprised everyone except Kendall. Operational systems still mattered more than branding once serious money entered negotiations. Richard Bennett finally approached the table. You ready to proceed? Kendall opened the agreement calmly. Page after page. Equity conversion, buyout schedules, governance revisions, public disclosure language, employee protection guarantees. Every section reviewed, already dozens of times. Savannah watched him quietly while attorneys discussed procedural language around them. The strange thing was, Kendall no longer looked emotionally attached to Brooks' Table at all. Not cold, not bitter, just finished. Like a man finally setting down weight he carried too long. Richard cleared his throat. The board approved all employee retention clauses. Good, Kendall replied. Senior staff bonuses remain protected through restructuring. Good. The public statement acknowledges you as co-founder and former operational architect. Kendall simply nodded again. Titles mattered less now. Truth mattered more. One of the Westbridge executives leaned forward. For what it's worth, Mr. Diaz. Kendall looked up. Your systems are probably the only reason this company survived. Silence settled briefly around the room after that, because everyone there understood it was true. Savannah lowered her eyes toward the agreement in front of her. Kendall didn't look at her, not because he wanted to punish her, because some truths became too heavy once spoken aloud repeatedly. The attorneys began signing procedures shortly after 10 o'clock. Papers sliding across polished wood, pens clicking open, initials placed beside highlighted sections, a marriage reduced partly into legal structure and ownership percentages. Strange how quietly lives changed permanently. When the final buyout amount appeared on the closing statement, nobody reacted outwardly, but the number mattered. It represented 11 years of invisible labor finally acknowledged financially. Not gifted, not pitied, earned. Kendall signed his name carefully beneath the final transfer authorization. Clean handwriting, steady hand. Margaret witnessed the signature beside him, then Savannah signed next. For a brief moment, their signatures sat side by side, exactly like the old startup documents years earlier. Only now they meant separation instead of construction. After the final papers completed processing, Richard Bennett stood slowly. I owe you an apology, Kendall. Kendall closed his folder calmly. You owe the employees stability. Richard absorbed that quietly. Again, Kendall redirected everything toward the people still inside the company. Always. One of the attorneys handed Kendall the finalized wire confirmation sheet. Funds transferred successfully. Ownership closed. Corporate separation completed. That was it. 11 years reduced to legal finality inside a quiet conference room above downtown Nashville. No dramatic ending, no shouting, no revenge speech, just paperwork. Savannah finally spoke after nearly 2 hours of silence. What happens now? Kendall looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside the massive windows. Nobody steals from Brooks' table anymore. That's not what I meant. He knew. But answering honestly required care now, because anger had faded, and what remained underneath felt more complicated than blame. Kendall folded the signed documents neatly into his briefcase. I go home. Savannah stared at him quietly. Home. Not headquarters, not negotiations, not rebuilding the brand. Home. The word alone revealed how far apart their priorities had drifted over the years. Margaret stepped outside with opposing counsel to finalize filing copies, leaving Kendall and Savannah briefly alone inside the conference room. Rain moved softly against the windows behind them. Downtown Nashville looked muted beneath heavy clouds. Savannah spoke carefully. I keep thinking about the food truck. Kendall said nothing. The old freezer leaking everywhere. Still silence. You used to stay up all night fixing things before I even noticed they were broken. Kendall finally looked toward her. That became the problem. Savannah's face tightened slightly, because she understood immediately. He fixed so much quietly that eventually she stopped noticing effort altogether. Stability became invisible. Invisible things became easy to undervalue. Savannah rubbed at her hands slowly. I don't know when I stopped seeing you clearly, Kendall answered honestly. Probably around the time everyone else started applauding louder. That one hurt. He saw it immediately, but it was also true. Success surrounded Savannah with people who praised visibility, while Kendall operated deeper and deeper beneath the surface, keeping everything standing, until eventually she started believing the spotlight itself built the structure. Savannah looked toward the small cardboard box beside his chair. That's all you're taking? Kendall glanced at it. Yes. You built half this company. No, he corrected quietly. I built the parts nobody photographed. Silence again. Long this time. Then Savannah stood slowly from her chair, not as CEO, not as celebrity, just as the woman who once sat beside him inside a broken food truck, counting unpaid invoices at 2 a.m. I really am sorry. Kendall believed her now completely, and strangely, that made leaving easier, because forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. He stood and picked up the cardboard box. Not heavy. That was the strange part. After carrying Brooks' table on his back emotionally for over a decade, the box itself barely weighed anything. At the conference room door, Richard Bennett re-entered holding finalized copies. It's done, he announced quietly. Yes, it was. Kendall walked through the executive hallway one final time, carrying the small box against his side. Employees looked up as he passed. Some nodded respectfully. Some looked ashamed. Leah Turner stepped out from operations just before he reached the elevators. You really, leaving Kendall managed a faint smile. I already left weeks ago. Leah hugged him quickly before he could stop her. Thank you, she whispered disarmed. Not for the lawsuit, not for the money, for the years, the protection, the systems, the invisible labor that kept all of them employed. Kendall stepped into the elevator moments later. As the doors closed, he caught one final glimpse of Brooks' Table headquarters, reflected in polished steel. The company would survive, changed, damaged, smaller perhaps, but alive, and for the first time in 11 years, its survival no longer depended entirely on him. 1 year later, Kendall Diaz unlocked the front door of Diaz Advisory Group at 6:11 every morning. Same routine, same black coffee in a paper cup from the diner across the street. Same quiet walk past dark storefront windows before sunrise touched downtown Kansas City. His office sat above an old insurance building near Walnut Street. Nothing glamorous, no marble lobby, no celebrity branding, no investors waiting beside elevators. Just 2 small conference rooms, 3 desks, a reception area, and a brass plaque beside the door with simple lettering, Diaz Advisory Group, Financial Risk and Operations Consulting. Kendall preferred it that way. Silence felt different now. Lighter, the office smelled faintly of printer toner and fresh coffee instead of stress hidden beneath expensive cologne and television lighting. He unlocked the door, turned on the lamps, and reviewed payroll projections for a family-owned restaurant client in St. Louis before most of the city woke up. Some habits never left him. Around 7 a.m., his assistant Maya arrived carrying pastries from a bakery downstairs. 30 years old, former hospitality accountant, smart enough to notice details without needing attention for it. She set a paper bag on Kendall's desk. "You've been here since 6 again. 5:48. Maya shook her head. "One day you're going to discover weekends exist." Kendall almost smiled. Doubtful. She sat across from him holding a folder. "The Turner family restaurant in Wichita wants another meeting. The barbecue place." "Yeah, their investor agreement's a disaster." Kendall opened the file immediately. Predatory expansion clauses, weak vendor protections, no emergency liquidity planning. He recognized the pattern instantly. People chasing growth without understanding exposure underneath it. A year ago, stories like this would have irritated him. Now they simply clarified his purpose. Diaz Advisory Group quietly became known among small business owners across Missouri, Kansas, and Tennessee. Not because Kendall advertised aggressively, because owners talked. The quiet consultant who caught hidden fraud clauses, the former restaurant executive who rebuilt payroll systems after bankruptcies, the man who reviewed contracts line by line before clients signed away control of their companies. Kendall never raised his voice during meetings, never delivered motivational speeches. He just found structural weaknesses before they destroyed people. And strangely, clients trusted him more because he never tried sounding impressive. At 9:30 a.m. a young couple arrived carrying spreadsheets and visible panic into Conference Room B. They owned a small coffee roasting company outside Overland Park. Rapid growth, bad debt, aggressive expansion pressure from outside investors. Kendall listened quietly while they explained their situation. Most consultants interrupted constantly, trying to sound intelligent. Kendall listened longer than he spoke. Always had. The husband finally rubbed his forehead anxiously. "We thought scaling fast meant success." Kendall reviewed the numbers silently for another moment. Then he looked up. "Scaling safely is success." The couple exchanged a glance. That sentence alone probably saved them several $100,000. By afternoon, rain tapped softly against the office windows, while Kendall reviewed operational restructuring plans for another client. His phone buzzed once beside the keyboard. "Leah Turner." He answered immediately. "How bad?" he asked first. Leah laughed softly. "You always assume I'm calling with disasters. You usually are. Not today." Kendall leaned back slightly. "How's Nashville stable finally?" Brooks' table survived. Smaller now, less glamorous, but stable. Several locations closed during restructuring. Investor relationships changed completely. Westbridge Foods reduced expansion plans significantly. Savannah disappeared from television for nearly 6 months after the scandal. No dramatic public collapse, no screaming interviews, just quiet retreat. And honestly, Kendall respected that more than performance. Leah continued. "Payrolls clean, vendor debt stabilized, employee retention better than expected." "Good. She implemented your operational recommendations." Kendall nodded silently. That didn't surprise him. The systems always worked once people actually followed them. Leah hesitated briefly before continuing. "She also made another public statement today." Kendall looked toward the rain-covered windows. "What kind?" "She acknowledged you officially." "Interesting. Not emotionally interesting, just unexpected." Leah continued carefully. "National interview, business channel. Kendall remained quiet. She said Brooks' table only survived because of the systems you built. That sentence hung softly through the phone line. A year ago, hearing it might have reopened something painful inside him. Now it mostly felt distant, like listening to weather reports from another city he used to live in. Leah lowered her voice slightly. "I thought you should know. Thanks." After the call ended, Kendall sat quietly for several seconds, staring at the spreadsheets still open across his desk. Then he went back to work. Not because the acknowledgement meant nothing, because he no longer needed it to understand his value. That changed everything. Around 4 p.m., Maya entered carrying mail and paused near his office television. "You're on TV." Kendall looked up. A business news segment played silently across the wall-mounted screen. Savannah Brooks sat inside a studio interview, wearing a simple navy blazer. No flashy branding, no glamorous performance, just direct answers. A headline below the screen read, "Brooks Table CEO discusses recovery after fraud scandal." The interviewer asked something Kendall couldn't hear. Savannah answered calmly. Then one sentence appeared in subtitles across the bottom of the screen. "The truth is, Brooks' Table was built on systems Kendall Diaz created long before anyone noticed them." Maya looked toward him carefully. "You okay?" Kendall watched the screen another moment. Savannah continued speaking, not emotionally, not dramatically, just honestly. For once, he finally looked back down at the contract on his desk. "Yeah," he said quietly. And surprisingly, he meant it, because peace didn't arrive through revenge. It arrived the moment he stopped needing invisible people to finally see him. Evening settled slowly across downtown Kansas City. The rain stopped around sunset. Office lights glowed warmly across quiet streets while Kendall finished reviewing one last payroll protection plan for a family-owned diner in Omaha. Simple work, important work, real work. At 6:42 p.m., he shut down the computer and gathered his coat. Maya already left for the evening. The office sat silent around him. No crisis meetings, no investors, no emergency lawsuits waiting overnight. Just calm. Kendall walked through the small office, turning off lights one by one before stopping briefly beside the brass company plaque near the entrance. Diaz Advisory Group, his name this time, not hidden behind someone else's spotlight. Outside, cold evening air moved through the city streets, while traffic lights reflected softly across wet pavement. Kendall locked the office door and slipped the keys into his coat pocket. Then he stood still for a moment beneath the fading orange glow of sunset over Kansas City. 11 years building a company for someone else, 1 year rebuilding himself quietly afterward. No headlines could measure that correctly. No interview could fully explain it. But Kendall understood something now that he hadn't understood during all those years inside Brooks' Table. The strongest foundations in life were usually built by people nobody applauded while they were building them. And sometimes, walking away calmly was the first moment a man finally stopped disappearing inside his own life. Some people spend years building foundations that nobody notices until the building starts collapsing. That was Kendall Diaz. He was never the loudest person in the room. He never chased attention, applause, or public praise. But when the people around him stopped valuing honesty, discipline, and quiet loyalty, the truth eventually revealed itself through actions, records, and time. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that being needed is not the same as being appreciated. Many people will enjoy the stability you create, while slowly forgetting the sacrifice it took to build it. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not to scream, beg, or destroy everything in anger, but to walk away calmly with their dignity still intact. Kendall didn't win because he was louder. He won because he stayed prepared while everyone else became careless. He trusted facts more than emotions, systems more than ego, and in the end, truth became heavier than performance. If this story meant something to you, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by people who only noticed your value after you were gone? And if you enjoy deep stories about betrayal, resilience, quiet strength, and real consequences, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story might hit even closer to home.